So, if the first time you've ever heard of Windows Vista was over a decade ago, like me, you've also probably been told at some point in your life that it is a horrible OS. Whether that's down to system crashes, poor performance, or user account control, or a mix of all those things or something completely different, it does not have the greatest reputation among different versions of Windows. But a lot of that was when Windows Vista launched, coming up on 20 years ago. And as an avid enjoyer of Windows Vista, I want to really see what it's actually like to use it. So how badly could it end daily driving this OS for a week? It doesn't suck? And how did I even do this? Those are some great questions, so let's get started. So before I get started, I do need to clarify that this is using Windows Vista specifically as my main desktop OS. I can still use newer versions of Windows to do things that I really can't or shouldn't do on Windows Vista, and I can still use things like Linux or mobile phones or gaming consoles. Now for some context behind Windows Vista, its development period was kind of tumultuous. Originally conceived as an intermediary release between the Whistler and Blackcomb projects, which became Windows XP and morphed into Windows 7 to an extent, Longhorn quickly became a very bloated and directionless project, with the project team calling it a pig, former developers saying that it couldn't be dog-fooded, which was a very commonplace practice at Microsoft, and its status as the only version of Windows that Microsoft has just reset development on. It was by no means in a good state. The actual OS that became Vista, however, would be developed in a 2-year time span and would be released to manufacturing in 2006. Reviews of it were mixed. Microsoft tried to hide some of the rushed state that Vista was in when it released by giving reviewers Acer Ferrari laptops. But this didn't stop a reviewer from the Register from criticizing the OS in a very detailed article. Now with 2 different service packs, things got much better for Vista. However, this wouldn't be enough to save it, as it would be superseded by Windows 7 in late 2009, which quickly overtook it in sales and became much more popular. Windows Vista was discontinued in 2017, having never really gained dominant market share. Now, in hindsight, a lot of people have argued that Windows Vista was misunderstood. Despite this being my favorite version of Windows, a status that it's held for a very long time, I can understand where somebody would be coming from when they don't really like Windows Vista. User account control, for example, was incredibly excessive and only had 2 options, on or off. Not to mention that the average person's home desktop computer was likely not up to the task of running Vista, especially with Aero in a stock configuration. My family stayed on Windows XP on a Dell Dimension computer until I, when I was very young, knocked that Dell Dimension off a desk and it broke. By which point Windows 7 was out and my family proceeded to buy a Lenovo C205 which had Windows 7. And despite that thing not being the best PC, it could at least handle Windows 7 tolerably for me and my older sister. Arguably, the thing with Vista and a lot of its issues just implies that it simply needed more time in the oven. Windows 7 released in late 2009 and was relatively similar to Vista, just with some software removed and a number of features added. But anyway, I think it's time that we should look at the computer we're going to be using for this. And that PC would be the Dell Vostro 230. While it may not be the most solid thing, it does hit Windows Vista in the sweetest spot I can hit it in at the moment. Originally shipping with Windows 7, it is arguably among the upper echelon of anything Windows Vista was really intended to run on when it was new, evident by its Windows Experience Index score of 5.1. And with Windows Vista, that score could only go up to 5.9, as opposed to 7.9 in Windows 7 and 9.9 in later versions of Windows. It also comes with an Intel Core 2 Duo, which, as other creators have pointed out, is still relatively robust to this day. The Core 2 Duo in particular is an Intel Core 2 Duo E8400, clocked at 3 GHz, which is not that bad, given that it was one of the best processors when this PC was new. To ensure that graphics are good in games and with Aero, this thing has an NVIDIA GeForce 310, which may not be the most legendary or iconic of a GPU, nor have I tested its performance on Crysis, but it at least gets the job done and can play YouTube videos and whatnot. In addition to 4 GB of PC3 8500 DDR3 SD RAM. While I hear a lot of people say that 2 GB of RAM is the minimum for having a good experience with Windows Aero and Vista, 4 GB is my comfort zone. This thing also has a spinning hard drive, but still overall a relatively solid PC, especially for 2010 when it would have been brand new. So anyway, it's time to get prepared for this, and to put it simply, that was relatively simple. This PC already has an install of Windows Vista on it, and one that has been used in numerous videos prior to this one, and my only main hurdle was that, as it turns out, Audacity doesn't really support Windows Vista despite the developers claiming that it supposedly will work, even though they don't test older versions of Windows anymore. Windows Vista is also kind of limited in areas. For example, it cannot play MP4 video in Windows Media Player. Luckily, VLC still supports Windows XP to this day, and so it obviously still works on Windows Vista. But once I had everything all prepared to go, it was simply a case of waiting, and this was a hard thing to do, but after that was done, it was time. To start things off, the footage you're seeing isn't actually from day one yet. I decided to start this and end this at midnight, and the footage you're seeing is actually from the prior day. I was working on a video quite late, and as you can see, it was just about midnight. This was something I really wanted to get out in the middle of the week, but I was able to get it done before midnight. I will need to go back to it briefly later in the week, but it should be relatively good. And because I was still awake, I basically just turned the computer on. I had to resist starting this early, and I already had been creating some stuff in the calendar, which was exactly the first thing I went to when I powered the PC on. I set up a couple basic tasks and a couple events, followed by setting up the log for everything I'll be doing this week, and then I played a bit of solitaire before I went to bed. Once I woke up after getting relatively mediocre sleep, this may or may not be a common theme in this video, I did more stuff in the calendar, played another game of solitaire, and had a bit of a thing for constantly changing the background. And this one that you see here is not the final one for the day. Now, something interesting did occur while I was playing solitaire. I had to readjust the position of the mouse cable because I wasn't getting the best range with pointing. During this process, while playing solitaire, I accidentally knocked the monitor cable loose and turned off the monitor. Whoops. Eventually, I decided that there was better things to do, and so I opted to create a bucket list for things I wanted to do during the week. Later in the day, I decided it was time to install a game, specifically Bejeweled 2. This time, I have a boxed copy of the game, and I opted to install that copy. I played a lot of Bejeweled 2 for the rest of the day, which may or may not become a bit of a recurring theme in this video, just like in previous entries in this series. Again, a little foreshadowing, but you never know. And that leads me to the conclusion of day one. It was surprisingly easy to get by, especially when taking into account that I basically did not connect the computer or browse the web throughout any of the day. Okay, well, I did use my phone, but again, as I said at the start of the video. So how did day 2 play out? So, day 2 began in a similar light to day 1, keeping track of things in the calendar. Seems a bit repetitive, isn't it? Just like user account control, which I want to either reduce the functionality of or simply turn off entirely. This led to a lengthy expedition into the depths of System 32, where I found stuff like the phone dialer and private character editor, stuff I'm pretty sure have not changed at all since Windows Vista or even in Vista, alongside some of the other doohickeys that Microsoft puts in their OS. Ultimately, I was looking for an entry for user account control settings, which should have the icon of the user account control shield. As it turns out, though, this was introduced in Windows 7. And to put it bluntly, I eventually figured out that I have to go to the user account control panel to turn off user account control. And again, there's no sort of option to put it at a lower setting. It's either on or off. Once this was dealt with and the system was restarted, I opted to play some Portal. For this, Portal will run perfectly fine. It doesn't need to be put into compatibility mode, but I did opt to lower the resolution, primarily for performance improvements. And I opted to just continue the gameplay that I was doing like months ago, to which I ended up getting the Portal gun upgrade. And then it was time for some Bejeweled 2. Alas, I'm not going to go into detail on it yet, because I want to save that for a slight bit. In the evening, I set up a playlist with a lot of tracker music I have, primarily so I can have something good to listen to throughout the rest of the week. And now, for perhaps a bit of an interesting thing, a game night. I opted to play 4 games, and the 2 that I will bring up first are Peggle and Zuma's Revenge, primarily since with both of them, I didn't get footage of them, but I first started off with Bejeweled 2. It's not easy to really commentate well on Bejeweled 2 gameplay, because it's a match 3 game from 2004. It's essentially like as if your mom tried to make a gaming channel or live streaming thing on Twitch while trying to only play like Candy Crush. But I was able to get a lot of good moves. I am relatively good at this game, especially in endless mode, especially the number of hypercubes I got. I really was desperate to get these because me, but once I started getting them, it was hard to stop. It essentially eliminates all of the gems of one color from the board. But alas, I can't just play Bejeweled 2. I need to have something of more substance. And to that, Halo. I opted to set it at the same resolution as Portal was set to earlier, and I swept through the Pillar of Autumn. It wasn't the easiest in areas because I wasn't entirely sure where to go, but I think it's safe to say that this is the furthest I've got in a Halo game. I did have a couple scares at points, but I did figure out how to get off the Pillar of Autumn, and I decided to stop it at this point for evading Covenant convoys, primarily because it was starting to get late. And that was it for day 2. Day 3 was a bit interesting, because it was my birthday. But to start off day 3, I opted to organize a lot of my photos I put on here. I should say that I have a thing for photography, although I never really tried to do any of it professionally. Needless to say, things were gonna get a bit interesting in the evening, or in the afternoon, as the weather was a bit adverse. This didn't stop me from doing a bit of an analysis of my SSD, or my portable SSD, that is not being used whatsoever, to see if it would actually work on here, and it does. And this was followed by more Bejeweled 2, because I should tell you, I did not exclusively play Bejeweled 2 on day 3. I did other stuff, but I never really recorded it. Although I did change it to be windowed instead of full screen, because I'm pretty sure that the full screen presence of Bejeweled 2 was messing with my eyes. And there was one other thing that I did on day 3. By this point, I had used a couple exceptions because I needed to upload a video and also transfer over video clips, but this time it wasn't Windows 11 that I had to temporarily boot up. It was a Windows 8.1 PC. This is definitely going to be a dedicated video because it is a device of both personal sentiment and significance, and also something that is kind of interesting overall. But I need to set this thing up because, to put it simply, it was a birthday gift that I got and I needed to set it up. Also, while this footage is barely legible, I did update the log a bit before I went to bed. Day 4 started with, God, this is getting very old very quickly. Well, I did go online temporarily to go scout out some websites to download off the Wayback Machine and places for a video project that I was going to be filming later in the week. I didn't want to go too in-depth online because the concept of putting any of these old versions online genuinely terrifies me for some reason. But once I was done and got some additional websites off of some flash drives, it was a case of rebooting the system. Although something was on the horizon. Let me tell you this. Do you have a fascination or interest in weather that both terrifies you and fascinates you? Regardless of what I just asked, how terrifying do messages like this look to you? Now that being said, I'm from Michigan and I'm from Detroit, and so these storms were nowhere near me at the time. Needless to say, during the day, weather conditions got better, as the real thing of concern wouldn't be until that evening, supposedly. And so I opted to play Portal on a new game, because I often get terrified by it when I start to see androids in the game. And then that night was supposedly when a lot of the storms were to happen, only for nothing. Literally nothing. Not a roar of thunder, and not a single flash of lightning. Oh well, I guess just breathe and relax at this point. In fact, day 5 otherwise began with, you guessed it, more calendar. I at least sprinkled in some management of contact info in here, so it's not all just calendar. Regardless, I feel like, at least for now, the presence of calendar is a bit of a good palate cleanser, given all the times I've started the day with Bejeweled 2 so far. On that note, once I was done with the calendar, Bejeweled to Peggle. Maybe you saw that one coming. I honestly can't be sure. Now, as I said, I did play Peggle earlier during that game night, but you can really tell my Peggle skills here. They're okay. I've beaten this game, and I've 100%ed levels before. I'm pretty sure I did so in my Windows Vista in 2026 video, but this game is arguably as fun as it was for me way back in the day. Likewise, this was followed up by a good pairing with Peggle, Bejeweled 2. However, even if I play Bejeweled 2 for a good chunk of the main day, this video is supposed to be using Windows Vista for a week, not playing Bejeweled 2 for a week. That's just a side quest. And so, later in the day, I opted to add more things to the calendar. Specifically holidays, which I kept track of using Microsoft Excel. This video is not about using Windows Calendar from Windows Vista for a week either. So how about I go mess around with the sidebar? The sidebar was a big thing with Windows Vista, especially from the start. I customized this a little bit, and then I also played the puzzle game that is on it. And after logging some of my activities, I thought that it'd be good decided to play some Tinker, not to be confused with the Python GUI library. To put it simply, I've never really played this game before, but it sticks out among Windows stock games, kinda like Purple Place. This game was also exclusive to the Windows Vista Ultimate Extras, which probably also explains why it isn't always brought up as much as Purple Place, but I had a bit of fun for this before a game of Texas Hold'em. This was simulated, by the way. I do not have any understanding of how it works, but I was able to somehow get 4th place among 6 players, all of this being simulated. At this rate, I might as well have just done a second game night that was completely unplanned. And I finished it with Bejeweled 2. And now we get to day 6. In fact, day 6 had already begun by the time that I got footage of some of this lightning and thunder and stuff. Okay, well, I'm not going to dabble too much on day 6 because, to put it lightly, I started the day off with Peggle, and then just about the rest of the footage I got for that day was Bejeweled 2. With the one exception being the one piece of footage I recorded for what at the moment was the previous video. Although in my books, it's not the end of the world. I didn't go into detail too much on some days in Windows 7 for a week, but enough talking about this. Let's just get to day 7. So, for some context, in these videos, I treat day 7 a bit differently compared to the rest of the week. As it's the final day of using the OS, I typically do cleanup, backing up data, and transitioning back to my main PC. And this time will be no different. Despite this, I made it clear that I'm not done yet. I started the day by playing Peggle, in addition to adding more stuff to the calendar and the log. I also got some B-roll during the day, followed up by playing more Bejeweled 2, something that continued into the evening. But that gameplay of Bejeweled 2 was going to be the last for the video. And at only a couple hours before midnight, I decided to finish things off by playing some Inkball. I haven't played it too extensively. I did so earlier in the week, but I wanted to finish this with Inkball as a sort of homage to one of my earliest videos that involved Windows Vista. I honestly don't know why. And after this, it was time to start copying files over to a flash drive. And after this was done, that was essentially it. Again, by this point, it was only a couple hours before midnight, and I wasn't likely going to be using the computer for much longer in the day. And that essentially concludes day 7, and by extension, my time using Windows Vista for a week. One additional bonus clip to the secret game mode I found in Bejeweled 2 a few days after this, but I don't need to elaborate too much more on that. So now I think it's time to draw conclusions. So, to conclude, using Windows Vista for a week felt really nice. Even though you could argue I am slightly biased towards this OS, at least to an extent, and even though I said it was kinda nice, I feel like there's things that I could have gone better with. One thing to note is that I didn't record everything that I did during the week, and that's primarily because I viewed using Windows Vista for a week as a vacation, just like in Windows 8.1 for a week and Windows 7 for a week. However, with what I recorded, I feel like it could have been focused more on other stuff than a lot of the games I played. Where I feel things could have gone better is that, first of all, my sleep schedule got unusually thrown off during this week, and as a result meant I wasn't turning on the computer for the first time during the day until after noon. I also feel like I didn't really do enough when it came to browsing the web or using some of the programs like Microsoft Office. But I think that these shortcomings are useful and can be learned from, especially if I want to use Windows XP for a week at a later time. But although I turned off user account control, performance and stability issues were non-existent. Windows Vista Service Pack 2 is very robust, at least compared to prior versions of Windows, and Windows Vista will run quite fine on anything that has at least a dual-core processor, 4 gigs of RAM, and a competent graphics device. There's nothing stopping me from having done this on, say, my ThinkCentre A70, which was at one point in time my main Windows Vista PC. And while that's a slightly newer PC than the Stel Vostro, it has only integrated graphics, and as a result, falters with even playing video. Now, if you should do this yourself, that depends. First of all, you have to be comfortable enough to use older versions of Windows for more extended periods of time. Additionally, setting it up may be kind of time-consuming, but there's nothing really stopping you from using Windows Vista for even more than just a week. Okay, well, newer processor support probably doesn't help, but I still have a point to make. Anyway, do you still use Windows Vista? If so, is it similar to what my experience was like? Even if you don't play as much Bejeweled 2 as me, did you use Windows Vista back in the day? If so, what's your thoughts on it? Should I try this with another OS next? I already did this with Windows 7 and 8.1 already. Did you enjoy this video, or is there something I forgot to address, or something that I could do to improve my content? If you have anything to say, let me know in the comment section, through my email, or through my Discord server, and feel free to give this video a like. But that's going to do it for this video, so thanks for watching, and have a nice day.